Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. I'm absolutely honoured today to be speaking to Kamel Hothi. Kamel has had an extraordinary career in banking. She started as a cashier in a local branch, and she ended up at the end of her career being responsible for major change programs in the bank, including mergers. And also she was very involved in redefining the bank after the global financial crisis. And all through her career, she's been passionate about inclusion. So, for example, she chaired the government task force for supplier diversity prior to the London Olympic Games. And she's now acting as a non-executive director on a number of companies and is acting as advisor and trustee to several boards, including the Queen's Commonwealth Trust and the Alzheimer's Society. For all her work, she's received numerous awards over the years for cultural cohesion and leadership of women, including an OBE for diversity in banking in 2017. So welcome, Kamel.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very honoured. Thank you, Cecilia.
Kamel, first I want to talk to you about diversity and inclusion and where we are on diversity and inclusion. We talk about it a lot, and I'm wondering if things are actually changing. And I'd be really interested in to have your perception on that.
Well, I suppose at my age, I have the privilege of being able to look back over that journey, working in a very male-dominated industry for like 40-odd years. And absolutely through that journey, I would say we have come far from when I first started, which was a very male, white industry. But now I think companies are absolutely realizing that they're having to change, that they're having to embrace inclusion. So we have come far. However, with it now comes new challenges and, new curveballs that constantly, especially with the world changing very fast. I think those challenges and those changes are causing a bit of a ripple effect. And I feel the pace of change is slowing down. So yes, we've come far, but there's a long way to go.
And when you say that the companies are realizing that they need to change, is that because they're being forced by internal pressure or perhaps shareholder pressure to change? Or is there a realization that that is just something that's expected by clients, that that's something that's good for business? Where's the motivation coming from?
I think it's a bit of a mixture of all. I would say shareholders is probably at the bottom of the pecking order because it's always about the income at the bottom line. However, I think customers are forcing change. Employees are looking for change, especially the next generation that are now coming into the working environment. They're looking for companies with much more purpose. They're looking for leaders with ethics and showing empathy and really very much has a good lens on understanding of inclusion. So those pressures are coming from employees, they're coming from customers and the world itself, with social media, everything is now so much faster, so much more demanding. And employers are realizing if they don't change, I think it will have a negative impact at their bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in your experience, what are the things that really make a difference on diversity and inclusion?
I mean, once again, one could start looking at lots of things could help, whether it'll be from having programs that will help individuals through the recruitment ladder and making sure that we're looking into the biases of those recruitment and those gatekeepers, right from the agencies to the interviewers, through then the program itself, all the way through the career. So as well as looking at opportunities, making sure that they're very inclusive. However, above all of those programs, which a lot of companies do invest a lot of money, and you have to do credit to a number of companies who are now looking at this stuff. For me, the biggest challenge and the biggest change comes from top, i.e. the leadership of a company. when a leader, whether it be the CEO or the exec boards, rather than delegating this stuff down to the talent teams or the HR teams or inclusion diversity teams, it's them. Until they actually emotionally connect and understand the role that they play as leaders, the impact that they can have with the words that they use, the consistency of their actions have to support the messaging that they get wheeled out on an executive sponsors event. That for me is the key thing. And until they embrace it, until they're passionately involved, I think this thing will still continue to be going at a slow pace.
Is that part of your work to work with boards and leaders to ensure that they are passionately involved?
I feel now, working within the company for 40 odd years, it's very difficult to sometimes see the wider picture. Now, for the last 4 years, especially with as a non-exec or TLC Lions, we've got about 250 companies that we support, and that's given me a really humble bird's eye view of the challenges that big corporates are facing. That they're desperate to get this right. But they're also very nervous to get, in case they do get it wrong, especially with the conversation around race is now very much in the limelight, whether it be in the media or certainly from colleagues now challenging them. All of that is making them slightly uncomfortable, making sure that they have it right. So for me, I think leadership is key. So hence, I'm one of those individuals, I don't like pointing fingers and saying it's because you are white or you don't understand or you're not. What's in it for them? How can I help somebody hold their hand? Because it's incumbent on me, coming from a lens of being a woman of color, coming from a very complex family background, coming from a different country. All of those nuances that I bring with me as an employee, it's incumbent on me as much to step forward and share my knowledge and share my challenges. So whoever's interested to understand what cultural behaviors that I bring to that table. And I'm hoping that if leaders are interested, that they also will join, but without the fear of, getting the words right, getting the language right. Yes, that's important, but actually let's just get around the table. Long as the questioning is coming from the right place, long as the leaders are curious and wanting to understand. And for me, that's how can I help them? How can I help them find that courage, step around the table and have that conversation with me so that we both learn. And then hopefully that will give them the confidence to do what they need to do.
I think that's certainly something that I feel is that sometimes when you talk about the languaging, that you feel as though, it used to have men and women, and now there's a whole range of different X's and L's and all sorts of alphabets, all sorts of letters. And then I think it's the same thing about race. There's what's coloured, what's black. And I really appreciate what you're saying about not worrying about getting the language wrong as long as people's hearts are in the right place. Because I feel that it can be, you can feel as though you're wanting to do the right thing and then tripping up on things that actually perhaps aren't that
Absolutely.
important.
And just to add to this, Cecilia, I think when I say, not get too hung up about the language, because it has to be the hunger and it has to be the curiosity that brings them to the table. But then when somebody has helped you to understand, well, actually, you can't use this word, or I don't recommend you using this word, or this is the best way to describe this particular community, then you want to be able to see that person has listened and they've absorbed. And yes, they'll stumble a couple of times, but they'll be corrected again. And once they've been corrected once or twice, you do want to see that person has really listened and they are then taking that knowledge and actually ensuring that they're correcting themselves, because that's when it's really seeing the power of that this person does care and this person is interested. It's when that person hasn't listened and you're constantly going back on us, this is now the third or fourth time I've called you out or helped you understand. Then I think that could really backfire. So yes, come to the table. Don't get too hung up about the language. Long as you can demonstrate and get that health warning, look, I'm going to be clunky. I may not get the language right, but I'm really keen to understand, and get the permission of the individual. Could I ask curious questions that may sound inappropriate, but that's the only way we're going to learn. And once that's done, and really take time to listen and understand, and then try to ensure that you're correcting yourself.
Mm-hmm. And what are the sort of issues that you are working on with your clients? Well, who are your clients, first of all? And then what sorts of things are you working with them on?
Well, first of all, if I look at my charity partnerships, well, Alzheimer's, for example, dementia is the biggest killer globally. As the world population, we now live longer. Signs of dementia, not only as a carer for somebody living with dementia, but also working if you've got the first signs of dementia. So as corporates are having to really explore, how do you continue employing this talent when there might be dementia involved? But more importantly, the way I'm reading supporting Alzheimer's Society is when you look at the Black ethnic minority communities, mental health, and we don't even have a name for dementia. There's such a taboo subject of talking about this subject within your family. So I'm helping Alzheimer's societies how to reach out to the ethnic minority communities to ensure that we can help signpost them, educate them, and reassure them that this is not something to be shied away from. This is not something that you need to be embarrassed and lock yourself away, but this is how to open up. So that's how I'm doing it with Alzheimer's Society. But as far as TLC Lions concerned, where I'm non-exec, we've got companies from everybody from Sony, Warner Brothers, EY, to PwC, to Just Eat, to Delivery Hero. So just a very collected, diverse bunch of clients, which I love, because what that also brings is diversity of thought of how these companies are dealing with the subject in different ways. And the beauty of it is, Cecilia, every quarter, through with the help of Baroness Verma, who's the United Nations Chair for Women here in the UK, we champion a roundtable in Chatham House Rules, which allows these companies for the first time to come together and put competition outside the door, to really listen, talk together and say, look, actually, my CEO is not engaged, but yours is. Or we're really nervous about how do you start a race conversation, or what are the language barriers how have you overcome? So it's allowing these companies to explore and spotlight on issues in a very comforted roundtable, which I'm proud to chair. And that's where we learn, and I'm learning constantly of what the challenges are out there, how companies are overcoming them, and then sharing those best practices with each other.
Could you give some examples, perhaps, of things that you've heard in those roundtables, of the problems that the companies are facing and how they have perhaps some... Actually, I'd be interested to hear some people who've got it wrong and people who've got it right.
So the way that we do with TLC Lions, we do it through storytelling, because most of my life, as I said, there's been numerous, I've gone them through, and we've invested in them, unconscious bias training, first aider training, all of these very valuable toolkits that have been invested in. But actually, are they sustainable? Have they been tracked and see if they actually leave a sustainable footprint and make change happen? And that's where I get slightly frustrated. I don't think they do. So what we've tried to do is having real life stories of individuals coming through those lenses, whether it be race or whether it be disability or whether it be transgender, is getting individuals talking about the journeys that they've come through. So what we're trying to do is educate those listeners in that audience, be it leaders or, frontline staff, to understand what it feels like to be in the shoes of this individual. But more importantly, what I try to do is coach those storytellers in leaving those landing messages, the so what question. What have I learned through my life lessons now that I look back, whether it be through the lens of resilience or whether it be through the lens of imposter syndrome, words that the corporate, companies are so familiar with, translating those life lessons in very much in what does this mean for you? And from those sort of experiences and doing those storytelling, what I've noticed over and over again, yes, you want the storyteller to come in, but the so what question for me is so important. So the follow through, but more importantly, who's introducing that storyteller? So who's the exec sponsor that you've wheeled out? And it started coming out organically. Somebody was saying, well, actually, I'm the exec sponsor. Kamel, can I have a private chat with you? Mark was saying, look, I'm a white guy. I'm passionate about this cause, but I feel I'm a bit of an imposter myself because I've not experienced any challenges because I don't have any neighbors that are from a race background. And I really want to be authentic, but I don't know how, and I don't want to come across as just ticking a box. And this is I've experienced over and over again, where leaders are now feeling uncomfortable. They want to be seen doing the right thing, and they go in there, they, set the scene, and they read the prescripted words that the inclusion team have told them, but it comes across so robotic for me personally. And I hate to say this. So I'm ended up coaching a lot of the execs and saying, actually, what is your story? What makes you passionate about this cause? And by just listening through their own story, that actually somewhere through their lifetime, they would have experienced something that's either similar or somewhere around their family or somebody around them that they can use to actually instill that emotional empathy. And that's where it makes a real difference. So I think when leaders are showing their vulnerability, when leaders are saying, I don't know this, I haven't got the answer, that authentic vulnerability is really going down well with colleagues. So not as well as just the storyteller, but they're seeing their leaders coming forward and saying, actually, you know what? I don't know this and I want to learn, or I've experienced this myself, or I've watched my daughter and sister go through this and I want to help with gender, whatever it might be. When they're really passionate about the cause and they talk in those very human words, that for me has been one of the biggest shift changes for me.
I love that way, the way that by them telling their stories about their vulnerability, then that's able to connect with the vulnerability of other people. Because I imagine, as employees, we look at the CEO and they often look like these people who know it all, they've got it all, they've worked it all out. And I just love that way of them being vulnerable to connect with other people's vulnerability and the humanity in all of us.
Absolutely. I think, having worked under so many men or leaders and women leaders, actually, the old vanguard of a CEO or an exec or a senior leader is somebody who's command and control, somebody who has all the answers, or somebody who will dictate to you when, this is how it's going to get done. Where empathy is seen as a weakness, where saying I don't have the answers was seen as a weakness, where you having to collaborate may also be seen as a weakness, where you're asking, seeking answers from others across the team. But actually, my gosh, those leaders that do embrace that sort of leadership is about influencing. Leadership is empowering your team and encouraging them and giving them passion and purpose and creating those psychological safety spaces where they can challenge each other, but also challenge the leader on their thinking. Because surely then you'll come to a conclusion, whether you're developing a product or coming up with a solution that's been thought through right across your team. And wouldn't it be wonderful if those team members are coming from just diverse backgrounds? And I'm not just talking about color, I'm not talking about just LGBT or disability, but even, if I may say, coming from white lens, if you are the male, everyone comes from a different story lens. And if you've empowered them, it's okay to share your own personal views around this table. Then I think it's a really healthy environment. Then I'm hoping that whatever you're coming out with, what the solution you're looking for, would have been worked through and through so many different lenses that hopefully the end product for your customer will be so much more cleaner.
One thing I'd be really interested to hear your views on is, do you feel as though there is a woman's way of working and a woman's way of communicating that is different from a man's way? Or do you think that do you think that men need different things in a workplace than women do? I'd just be really interested in your views on that.
I think naturally nature has it that, women per se, I'm going to do the quote mark thing, seem to be much more nurturing. We're slightly bit more risk adverse. We probably question more the outcomes of a proposition, ensuring that it is balanced. So those are natural DNAs of what a female is. And what saddens me over the past 20, 30 years, women who have had to struggle to get up the ladder have tried to mirror the male persona. And unfortunately, they've tried, when you are impostering somebody, that's not you. you may be reading it wrong. And in fact, I've worked for women leaders who are actually much more harder and harsher and unfair than I would say some of my male leaders that I've worked under. But the male, there's a DNA about a male being much more confident. When you apply for a job, I think they only need to think that they're 70% and they'll wing the rest, and they'll apply for it. As a female, you have to be 120% sure that you have the expertise and the skills before you even think to throwing your hat in the ring. So those are sort of more characters, I think, over decades of where women have had to fight for their right to be at the table. So they have created those sort of reservations that we have to just think twice. However, when you're there at the table, being yourself and bringing your nurturing ability around that table, which is what I'm proud to say that leading my team eventually, when I did get the courage, is I was prepared to share my vulnerability. I was prepared to share what was happening at home and the challenges I was facing. Because what that created with my team, they started sharing me their vulnerabilities. And then together, we were acting more like a second family. They had my back because they knew I had their back. And that sort of mothering, you could call it mothering, nurturing, leadership, I would say became one of my successes.
What was it in you that led you to start to be more vulnerable?
Well, certainly, working up the career ladder in banking, over that period of time, I had a couple of heroes who were wonderful. And if it hadn't been for them, especially when I was being made redundant, and I reached out to Paul and, saying I'd been made redundant, he'd come and seen what I was doing once. And he said, look, actually, why don't you get on the train and come and see me? And, suggested that I come and join his team to start my initiative. So I think over that period of time, I've met 3 out of 150,000 over 40 years. So not that many, but that leadership style, they definitely were leaders who demonstrated that they were prepared, they were curious, they were asking questions, they saw past my gender, they saw past my race, and they were keen in is my idea, and that drove my purpose, that drove my passion to want to work for them. But more importantly, it was my personal life that I think eventually helped me to balance the leader I wanted to become. I come from a culture where most of my life, when I was born in India and I came here in the 60s. And my father was a civil engineer and a very proud man, and unfortunately couldn't use his skill sets here. And we're Sikhs, and landing in the 60s, we're wearing turbans and constantly being bullied at that time, with the National Front and even the MP telling us to go back home. All of the things that we hear about Black Lives Matter, but in the 60s, it was 10 times worse. And my father turned around one day when he decided to cut his hair and my brother's hair in order to integrate. He said, look, just keep your head down, don't rock the boat, and be subservient. Which is a completely opposite message what we're now trying to tell people, to be yourself at work. So when you're brought up with a message of keep being subservient, that took me many, many decades and decades to actually even recognize that I was being subservient. And the second message was, from my mum when I had an arranged marriage at 19, was your first duty is to be a dutiful wife and mother, care for your elders, your in-laws. Don't nag your husband because he might beat you or leave you. And that sense of honor. And she sort of literally held out her fist, and she said, in this fist, you take my honor with you. So don't let me down. So, and if you ever have any problems, don't share them with anybody outside of your home. Keep them to yourself. And when I did get married, and as I said, met my husband on my first day, the duty was actually, the job was secondary. Leave the job. Your duty's here. And it was my father, who was a wonderful, I call him my ally, who said, look, Kamel, if you want to carry on, you're going to have to do all the chores that's required of you. So I felt like a bit of a Wonder Woman, constantly changing my personality when I went to work, and then coming home, realizing I had no voice on how to navigate the politics of home life in this very complex Indian society. And that did cause me a lot of mental stress, and especially with my second child, I had postnatal depression. And to be honest, you could call it bullying at home just got too much, and I wanted to end it all. And I realized how dark place I'd got, and I needed help. So that's when I did it. If it had been for my 6-year-old son who came and saw me, found me, realized I had to do something. And so I reached the doctors. I started rebuilding myself at home and realized I had to put the oxygen mask on my face in order to be a stronger woman. And that's when I started sharing a bit more of myself at work to some of my colleagues, because I needed to talk, I needed to seek help. And when I started sharing my story with my colleagues, impact was emotionally moving, because I was surprised how much they wanted to do for me. I was surprised how much they admired me, how they thought that I was this inspiring person having to manage all of this for the last 20, 30 years that I'd never spoken about it. And that's what gave me hope that actually, I have been juggling all of this stuff very silently by myself. And with their encouragement, I think, is what actually sharing my vulnerability gave me hope. And that's when I started shifting the way that I managed my team.
Mm. Mm. Thank you for sharing that story with me. It really touches me very deeply. And what I'm hearing is that I don't know when you started to realize that you needed to change things, but I can imagine that during that time, it was an extreme loneliness.
Yes, it was. So you see, when we talk, I mean, that was in a couple of minutes, but we're talking about 40 odd years. Been married for 38, and I'm still living in the same household, same to my husband. And but the first 15, 20 years were very difficult. As I look at 19-year-olds now, and they look like young, they are young adults, still teenagers. And the pep talk I had with my husband was, even if you have to act like a servant in this household, that's how I want you to behave. And I don't want to paint him in any bad light, really, because what they'd experienced of thinking that, this young girl has been brought up here mostly in the UK, and maybe she's got some British behaviors or some modern behaviors, and, make sure she knows the brief. I think that's all it was. That's how it started. But as we know, in our culture also, we have this real hierarchy of age and seniority, and the mother-in-law right at the top, then the sister-in-laws, and I was basically at the bottom of the pecking order. And so all the chores, and as my career was progressing, even though I wasn't telling them anything because I didn't want anyone to get jealous, obviously they were aware of it because it was getting more obvious in the papers or in the news, or I was speaking on radio. Even though as soon as I got home, it was straight to the kitchen sink, doing all the ironing, all the cleaning, just not to rock the boat. I felt sorry for my children because I couldn't really, I wasn't there for them. I had all of these chores on my hand to complete. So it was a very, very difficult time in that journey. But as I said, if I hadn't reached out to the doctors, if I hadn't spoken to somebody at work, I probably wouldn't be here today. And so therefore, sharing my problems, seeking that counselling, and several counselling, not that one counsellor could help me all in one go because my situation was so complex, but there were little bits of understanding from each one that helped me shift my mindset, helped me find some hope, and actually also be empathetic to the women in my own household. How could I help them? Because that's the only way they knew how to deal with things, that their fears were driving their bullying, that I was going to do something, that I was going to change, that I was going to rock the boat. And in fact, over time, I'm so proud to say that my mother-in-law became my biggest advocate. She was so proud because the community was coming to her and saying, "Did you know your daughter-in-law was speaking here? We saw on telly." that she became so proud of what I was doing, because at home she saw that Kamel still came home, was still the daughter-in-law that's respected her, did all my chores, attended all the functions that she wanted me to attend, that I hadn't really changed. And for that, she was really grateful, I think. And in her later years, when she needed a lot of caring, the structure was still there, the foundations were still there. My sons now were looking after her. So actually, our infrastructure, I realized there's some really good in it. We just need to modernize it.
During that time, did you ever think of leaving?
That's a really difficult question, because nowadays divorce is quite well, I wouldn't say common, but it's more acceptable. But in my generation, no. Literally, as I said, when I had the arranged marriage, my mother said to me, do not come running home if you've got any problems. And in fact, the message is, as in my generation, is if you ever step outside of the marital home, you come in a coffin. You do not. There is no option. And it was even acceptable for men if they'll turn a blind eye if they're having affairs, or if they've been abusive, or there's domestic abuse going on. It was sort of like not accepted, but it was just ignored. That's how it was. And the female's role is to be the homemaker and to keep quiet and do the cooking, the cleaning without complaint. But actually, where that generation got it wrong is that, which is where my father, in a way, was very modern, and so was my father-in-law, actually. My father, when he said, look, we decided to come here, so we've got to integrate. And my father-in-law, bless him, said, if you want to keep on working, just try to balance the two. Find a way to navigate two roles. So I was very fortunate to have men in my life that were forward-thinking. Even though Dad didn't allow me to go on to further education, he had a huge chip on his shoulder because he wasn't allowed to find his skill set in the right job. But at the same time, I hope if he sees me now, he died many, many decades ago, and so did Dad, that they would be proud of, I'm still here. My mother-in-law unfortunately passed away last year. But I cared for her for 38 years. And so hopefully through that time, I've learnt my lessons. But I realize that we have to modernize. And I've got two beautiful daughter-in-laws, and I want them to have a career. I want them to actually pave up, their own future. If they want to be staying at home and be homemakers, that's fine. If they want to go and have a career, Palmy's in Disney. She's head of procurement. Priya's a deputy head assistant. And they both now got young children under the age of 3, both of them, 2 kids. But, again, it's up to them. But more importantly, I want my sons to be different type of husbands, to be sitting beside their wives, to encourage them, to support them. And I'm not saying that their father isn't somebody they shouldn't learn from. Certainly their father, his work ethics, his entrepreneurship of how he took us out of poverty, and his dreams and his ambitions, and supporting his brothers and the wider family, and building up a company now that the children are running. Absolutely, there's so much from him they can learn from the business side of Element. But my husband has adapted. He did allow me, then he saw my career shooting, and he saw me being very visible, which is very rare for my age group to be out there, outspoken and talking about this, that he empowered me. So he has adapted. He has changed, even in his generation. And then when I retired, it was very much do what you want to do. So I'm very blessed.
Well, Kamel, I would imagine that your father, your father-in-law, your mother, your mother-in-law, I would imagine they couldn't be more proud to have a daughter like you.
That's very kind of you. It can be for a female, I think, if you're a first. In one ways, it's very humbling. First Asian bank manager, first to do this. It is very humbling, but it's a very lonely place. And especially when you think you might be doing wrong, or you're forcing people to change when do they need to change. And when you're constantly, I'm an introvert, really. I'm not very good at coming forward. I like to be behind the scenes, and like I said, collaboration. I like to just behind, shut the door, let me just get on with it. So but I overthink everything, especially when it comes to family, when it comes to how could I support leaders? Am I doing the right thing? Am I encouraging them in the right way? I take this all so personally, because having gone through it for 40 odd years, it means so much to me. But for me, it's not just about work. It's how do I help? If I can help one woman or one couple or one family to balance both their work ethics with their home life, that for me is the key, is not to have any regrets. And like they say, when you in your dying days, I'm sure you don't want to say, well, actually, this is how many hours I worked. It'll be very much about family. It'll be about all of those things that you couldn't have done or wanted to do with your loved ones or your siblings or your children, or relationships you've broken and you couldn't repair. So I hope what I'm trying to coach is that balance of repairing and understanding yourself. What is it you want to do? What makes you tick? What are your biases? What is your purpose? What's the legacy you want to leave behind that you want your children or your company or anyone to talk about you? To be able to pause and look in the mirror now rather than 10 years' time when it's too late. To check in on yourself. These are my values. And are you sticking to those values? Or do you let your ego compromise your teams? So what is important for me is understanding yourself is, as Aristotle said, wisdom starts with understanding oneself first. And then from there, how do you create an inclusive culture?
And today, if you look and say, well, what do I, Kamel, want today? What would that be?
Even at the age of 59, I'm still learning. I'm still discovering. I'm still encountering what I call curveballs, especially in my personal life. As I try to understand and navigate my daughter-in-laws, understand my role as a grandmother, what I thought I was going to be as a grandmother is not quite maybe how it's playing out. The model of living under one roof, which was the model that I've worked under, and that which is what I thought we were going to be, 4 generations under one roof. Actually, it's time to maybe have a different type of model that allows space for my children and us to live in a different. So all of those I'm learning, and I hope I can adapt. I hope it's managing my mental stress through that, because the things that I dreamt of are having to change, to be more patient and explore that what makes me happy is not some kind of pinnacle pyramid top. Is actually everyday little things, everyday little nuances that make me smile, and it's those memories that I want to bank. So in my personal life, I hope I can continue to navigate my family into a space that we are all still connected, we respect each other, we can support each other in times of crisis, but at the same time giving each other space to grow. On the work front, I hope I can continue supporting companies in really understanding what inclusion is, not to overcomplicate it, helping leaders to show their vulnerability, helping leaders to be more compassionate and empathetic leaders, and then individuals to take responsibility. Stop pointing fingers at companies, stop pointing fingers at others. What are you responsible for? What's stopping you breaking that glass ceiling? What's stopping you finding your voice? And being honest with yourself, and then checking in and holding yourself to account, and being an ally for others. How can I help What's being an ally? What's being a bystander? How do you, continue supporting this bias structure, around you? What can you do? So I hope I can continue in my little way, without complexity, making it really simple and helping people find themselves and helping leaders find their vulnerability.
Kamel, there's a whole lot of other questions that I plan to ask you, but I just think that they wouldn't be appropriate now. I think that what we've just spoken about has been so vulnerable on your part. It would feel to me inappropriate to talk about things that are more political or high level. So I'd just like to come to my final questions. And so the first of those final questions is, what's the bravest thing you've ever done?
Wow. The bravest. That's a really difficult question for me, because I've always labeled myself a bit of a coward. And that comes back to that subservient attitude that Dad instilled in me. Times when I should have stood up for my children, times that I should have stood up for myself and I didn't. So I think the bravest, or the word brave, I'm not sure I can relate to that, but is speaking up. Speaking up and realizing that actually there's another way. And finding a way that I can speak up, that I can feel comfortable with. So starting the Asian strategy was, I think for me, my first understanding of politics, both in the corporate world, but also it's a way of actually still ticking the boxes in my community and helping them to realizing the errors of our ways. So I think my bravest was when I presented that Asian strategy to the board, which was the turning point for me.
I mean, when I look at you, I see someone who is immeasurably brave in doing things that you weren't sure that you should be doing them. You were taking risks. You were presenting things at a high level in the bank. You were really at the forefront of a change in ways of being, and that just seems to me just immeasurably brave. So I wanted to reflect that back to you.
Very kind of you, thank you. I think those for me were more signs of finding purpose. And if it hadn't been for those heroes, those, 3 men that I came across who either just spoke to me or hinted, they gave me the courage to step across. So for me, I think bravery comes with you can't do it on your own. You do need helping hands.
The last question I want to ask you is, if you had a message for people who are listening, what would that message be?
How can we be more human in both, especially in the working environment? Why is it that when we step in through those working doors that we live the human side of us at home? And for me now, the word inclusion, it's not about race or LGBT or transgender or disability or Black. Everybody has a story. Everybody comes from a different cloth. It's actually, how do we come together more inclusively and have those human conversations, to have curiosity to understand each other? More importantly, how can we build compassion and empathy in the way that we lead, to empower people around the table, that they have a voice and their voice is important.
I was listening to a scientist last night, and she was saying that she was one of the top US scientists, and she should have won a Nobel Prize but never did. And she said that often she was the only woman around the table. And there are studies that show that when you are the only woman or the only man or the only Black person or the only Asian person around the table, there is actually physiologically, it is extremely difficult to speak up.
Absolutely. And I think that's where allies come in, where you have friends outside of that round table, as you go in, seek their support. So somebody's giving you the moment to speak. Somebody's, quietening the rest of the room up so you can talk. And that's why what I was saying, that I don't think you can, these things do need those brave people also to recognize the role that they play, the impact they can have on just asking somebody, how can I help you? How can I make your work more easier for you? Surely that's a win-win for everybody.
Kamel, it's been just a real joy to me to speak to you and to hear your story. And I wish you just so much for all the work that you're doing. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.